Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking something absolutely massive, the global ripple effect of the 2026 Iran war. We're talking about a conflict that started as a localized military operation, but quickly exploded into a literal geopolitical earthquake, one that completely rewired the global economy, energy markets, and the entire balance of world power. Just to wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this right out of the gate, consider this. The immediate military cost to the U.S. alone hit $110 billion. And honestly, that was just the initial price tag before anyone even asked for additional funding, according to Al Jazeera. But the real cost was the crazy domino effect it unleashed on everyday lives and international alliances across the globe. So, here is our agenda for today. We're covering the spark of the war, choking global energy supply, the worldwide economic shockwave, the limits of missile defense, and finally, a new global power balance.
Section 1. The Spark of the War. How Operation Epic Fury ignited a crisis. Our analysis kicks off right at the epicenter on February 28, 2026. This is when we saw joint U.S. and Israeli strikes using incredibly sophisticated, multi-million-dollar precision munitions. But by early March, Iran is already firing back with its own missiles and drones. This immediate back and forth completely upends things, forcing massive global flight reroutings throughout March and April, and it all snowballs into a devastating maritime blockade by July.
The disruptions on the ground were instantaneous. Almost overnight, the skies just completely emptied out as thousands of flights were canceled. Tourists were literally left stranded, and regional infrastructure was paralyzed instantly. And we saw this conflict widen incredibly fast, from strictly military targets to vital civilian lifelines. We're talking industrial sites and critical desalination plants in places like Kuwait and Bahrain suddenly finding themselves right in the crosshairs.
Section 2. Choking global energy supply. The 900 million barrel deficit.
As this escalating conflict really started to choke the lifeblood of the global economy, by July 2026, Iran pulls a major strategic move. They respond with a dual blockade, shutting down both the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait at the exact same time. It was a highly calculated pincer movement. The goal was to destabilize the Gulf monarchies by launching a brutal war of attrition on their economies, directly targeting those energy facilities to create the maximum amount of leverage possible.
And the scale of this disruption, it's honestly hard to overstate. According to city estimates cited in our sources, this chokehold had the potential to cause global oil stocks to plummet by a staggering 900 million barrels. To put that into perspective, this single conflict didn't just upend crude oil, it completely threw global liquid natural gas markets into absolute chaos, specifically hitting Asian countries that heavily rely on Middle Eastern energy. In fact, the International Energy Agency compared this 2026 crisis directly to the 1970s energy crisis, the one infamous for severe stagflation and triggering major recessions. The IEA actually called the 2026 events the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. We're talking about acute shortages, rampant inflation, and severe currency volatility that will likely echo for decades.
Let's move to Section 3. The worldwide economic shockwave. From macro to micro impacts.
Now, what's really fascinating is how those regional energy blockades instantly triggered a worldwide macroeconomic shockwave. If we consider Gulf states like Bahrain and the UAE, key indicators, like real estate values, plummeted by a massive 30% between just March and July as total investor panic set in. The region practically whiplashed from an economic boom straight into bracing for a severe recession. Millions of expatriate workers were suddenly facing a very uncertain future as major infrastructure and real estate markets sharply contracted.
But taking a step back from all that high-level macroeconomic data, the real question we need to ask is, how does a geopolitical conflict like this actually hit your everyday wallet? Because believe me, it wasn't just central banks and hedge funds feeling the pain here.
The sources detail some incredibly severe, tangible impacts for everyday consumers all over the world. Over in the U.S., gas prices in California surged well past $5 a gallon. Down in Australia, the government actually had to creatively relax their diesel standards for 60 days just to guarantee that hospitals wouldn't run out of fuel. Meanwhile, in Kenya, sudden and massive fuel hikes sparked violent street protests and brought public transport to a complete standstill. And because natural gas is so vital for making fertilizer, global food prices basically skyrocketed overnight, creating a very real threat to worldwide food security. Meanwhile, inside Iran, the economic devastation was just absolute. It got so bad that the government was forced to issue a massive 10 million rial banknote purely to cope with wartime hyperinflation. Keep in mind, the country was already wrestling with 40% inflation before the war even started. So these strikes triggered an unprecedented, desperate dash for cash, leading to mass layoffs and a deeply strained financial sector.
Section 4. The limits of missile defense. What the conflict revealed about modern tech.
We've all heard for years about the absolute dominance of multi-million-dollar defense umbrellas, things like the Iron Dome and Patriot systems. And look, these networks are incredibly sophisticated. To be completely fair to them, they were highly effective during this conflict at doing what they do best, intercepting traditional rockets, ballistic missiles, and cruise missiles. But they have a really crucial vulnerability. It boils down to a classic case of asymmetric warfare. You have these incredibly expensive, highly advanced interceptors basically being exhausted by cheap, easily manufactured drone swarms. The Atlantic Council analysis highlights this perfectly. The conflict proved that these traditional defense networks just cannot independently guarantee deterrence, nor can they provide absolute regional stability against these overwhelming swarm tactics.
And this limitation of force, it extended to the offensive side of things too. In fact, despite the absolutely overwhelming scale of those initial U.S.-Israeli strikes that used cutting-edge stealth aircraft and precision munitions, intelligence sources could only confirm the destruction of about one-third of Iran's missile arsenal, meaning the vast majority of the stockpile actually survived. It's a stark reminder that sheer technological superiority doesn't always translate to the absolute elimination of a threat.
Finally, we reach Section 5, a new global power balance, the geopolitical earthquake. Analysts note something fascinating here. Iran actually achieves a strategic victory merely by surviving the assault as a functioning state. The source material draws some really stark historical comparisons to the Vietnam War. They point out that surviving overwhelming military force, completely against the odds, creates this moral and strategic win that ultimately shifts the entire power dynamic of the Gulf region.
When you step back and look at the broader geopolitical fallout, we see a dramatic global shift. The U.S. is documented as facing seriously damaged military credibility alongside an accelerated decline in its global dominance. European nations, absolutely terrified of the economic fallout, began distancing themselves from Washington, which actually pushed the 80-year-old NATO alliance right to the brink of collapse. And amidst all of this chaos, China quietly emerges as the dominant global winner, expanding its influence and capitalizing on this massive power shift without having to deploy a single soldier.
All of this leaves us with a profound final question to reflect on. With decades-old historical alliances fracturing and the global economy fundamentally shocked to its core, how will the world adapt to this newly decentralized power structure? Because one thing is for sure, when the dust finally settles on the 2026 Iran war, the world we once knew has been fundamentally rewritten. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those big questions and always keep looking at the bigger picture.